Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Kami ang ika-6 na pangkat na mag-uulat patungkol sa disaster risk reduction and management. Unang-una sa lahat, siguradong karamihan sa atin ay narinig na ang salitang disaster. Maaaring narinig natin ito mula sa mga balita o marahil ay naranasan na natin ito sa ating buhay. Alam natin kung gaano kalakas ang pwedeng maging epekto ng isang disaster sa ating paligid. Maaari itong magdulot sa pagkawasak ng mga infrastruktura at higit sa lahat, kamatayan. Ngunit, paano nga ba natin mapipigilan ang mga gantong sakuna? Ano ang mga dapat nating tandaan at gawin upang makaligtas tayo sa oras ng sakuna? Ilan lamang ito sa mga katanungan na ating masasagot sa aming pag-uulat. Ano nga ba ang kahulugan ng salitang disaster? Ang disaster ay ang mga pangyayari na nagdudulot ng pinsala sa isang komunidad na maaaring magdulot ng pagkasira ng kapaligiran, infrastruktura at ang pinakamalala sa lahat, kamatayan. Ilan sa mga halimbawa ng disaster na nangyari sa ating bansa ay ang pagkasira ng bayan ng Gian sa Samar dahil sa bagyong Haiyan noong 2013, landslide sa Itogon, Benguet noong 2018 kung saan 58 ang naiulat na patay, ang 7.8 magnitude na lindol na yumanig sa buong Luzon noong 1990, at pagkabaon ng mga kabahayan dahil sa pagsabog ng Bulkang Taal noong Enero 2020. Makikita sa mga pangyayaring ito kung gaano kalala ang maaaring maging epekto sa atin ng disaster. Ngayon naman ay magtungo na tayo sa iba pang mga bagay na dapat nating malaman tungkol sa disaster. Sandali! Ngunit bago ang lahat, alam nyo ba na ang salitang disaster ay mula sa French word na disaster? Ito ay ang pinagsamang dalawang salita na des na ang kahulugan ay masama at aster na nagkakahulugang star. Isang salita na nagkakahulugan ng kamalasan ayon sa astrological beliefs. Ngayong alam nyo na ang pinagmula ng salitang disaster, magtungo na tayo sa iba pang salita na konektado sa disaster. Hazard. Ang hazard ay ang mga pangyayari na maaaring magdulot ng pagkasira ng paligid, kagamitan o kamatayan. Masasabi natin na ang paligid na ating ginagalawan ay maituturing na hazard sa kadahilan ng maaari itong magdulot ng pagkasira o panganib. Sunod naman ay ang vulnerability. Ang vulnerability ay ang kahinaan ng isang tao, bagay o lugar na maaaring maging sanhi ng mas bataas na posibilidad na malagay sa panganib dahil sa mga hazard sa kapaligiran. Isang halimbawa ng vulnerability ay ang pagiging isang bata. Bilang isang bata ay mas nahaharap tayo sa panganib sa ating kapaligiran. Ang simpleng pagtawid sa kalsada ng walang kasamang matanda ay maaaring magdulot ng pinsala sa isang bata o kaya ay mahantong sa kamatayan. Exposure. Ang exposure ay ang sitwasyon ng mga tao, bagay o lugar na malapit o nasa isang lugar na madalas pangyarihan ng hazard. Isang halimbawa nito ay ang mga tao at infrastruktura na nakatayo sa Pacific Ring of Fire. Ang panghuli ay ang disaster risk na tumutukoy sa posibilidad na pinsalang matatamo ng isang tao, bagay o lugar dulot ng iba't ibang faktor tulad ng hazard, exposure, vulnerability at capacity.
Disaster exists in the Philippines primarily because of our geographical location. As shown in the picture below, our country is located within the Pacific Ring of Fire, which explains the existence of volcanoes in our country as well as the occurrences of earthquake and tsunamis. Moreover, our country is also located along the Pacific Typhoon Belt, which explains the occurrences of typhoons and tropical storms in the country. In fact, an average of 20 typhoons visit the country every year, and 5 of these are said to be destructive. Disaster risk reduction is aimed at preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk and managing residual risk. all of which contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore to the achievement of sustainable development. Meanwhile, disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses. There are three types of disaster risk management. First, we have prospective disaster risk management. These are activities that address and seek to avoid the development of new or increased disaster risk. They focus on addressing disaster risks that may develop in future if disaster risk reduction policies are not put in place. Examples of this are better land use planning or disaster resilient water supply systems. Second, we have corrective disaster risk management. These are activities that address and seek to remove or reduce disaster risks which are already present and which need to be managed and reduced now. Examples are retrofitting of critical infrastructure or the relocation of exposed populations or assets. Lastly, we have compensatory disaster risk management, or also called as residual risk management. These are activities that strengthen the social and economic resilience of individuals and societies in the face of residual risks that cannot be effectively reduced. Examples are preparedness, response, and recovery activities. Also, different financing instruments such as national contingency funds, contingent credit, insurance and reinsurance, and social safety nets.
For the risk management measures, there are two types: the structural and the non-structural measures. These measures help mitigate or reduce the impacts and risks of hazards. The first type is the structural measures. These are any physical construction to reduce or avoid possible impacts of hazards, or the application of engineering techniques or technology to achieve hazard resistance and resilience in structures or systems. These include engineered solutions such as redesigning buildings and designing physical barriers to disaster events to reduce damage. More specific examples of structural measures are seawalls, structure of dams, strengthening buildings through building codes, dikes, and riprapping of mountain slopes. On the other hand, non-structural measures focuses more on administrative measures. These are measures not involving physical construction, which use knowledge, practice, or agreement to reduce disaster risks and impacts. In particular through policies and laws, public awareness raising, training, and education. Included here are the following: land use management, infrastructure policies, awareness, risk reduction and management policies, along with other social solutions such as early warning, evacuation planning, and emergency response preparedness. Both of these disaster mitigation measures are important as it lowers the impact of disasters when they inevitably occur.
In 2010, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, or Republic Act 10121, was passed and approved after 21 years of revisions and refiling. Isinasaad sa RA 10121 ang layong magkaroon ng epektibong pagbawas ng panganib at nararapat na aksyon bilang pagtugon sa disaster na maaaring kaharapin ng bansa. Kabilang sa pinagtutuunan ng batas na ito ang mainam na paglikha ng mga plano at balangkas na makatutulong sa layunin ng batas. Dahil sa RA 10121, naitatag ang National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. Mula ito sa ahensya ng National Disaster Coordinating Council na naitatag noon pang 1970. Ang NDRRMC ay tinatag ng may pinag-igting na layunin sa pagpapatupad ng Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. Sa slide na ito makikita ang NDRRM Framework 2020-2030. The goal of this NDRRM framework is to achieve safer, adaptive, and disaster-resilient Filipino communities toward sustainable development. Kung inyong mapapansin sa kaliwang bahagi ng slide, mayroong dalawang pie na may spring sa gitna. Yung nasa babang pie, pinapakita nito kung ano ang priority ng pamahalaan. Noong 2011, pantay ang prioridad para sa 4 na thematic pillars. Ang prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, at rehabilitation and recovery. Yung sinasabi ko naman na spring ay yung arrows na umiikot pataas. Pinapakita na mula 2011 patungong 2020, paulit-ulit na dinadaanan ang bawat piraso ng pie hanggang sa naging malaki na ang parte ng prevention and mitigation. Yung spring ang sumisimbolo sa siklo ng progreso ng pag-aaral sa mga bagay na saklaw ng bawat thematic pillars. Bago, habang at matapos ang isang sakuna, masusi itong inaaral upang maiwasan ang malaking danyos na maaaring maiwan matapos ang disaster. Makikita naman sa gitnang bahagi na mula sa risks, ang aksyong nasasakop ng thematic pillars ay laging nag-overlap at nakasuporta sa isa't isa. Sa pinakakanang bahagi naman nakikita kung paano inaaral ang risks na upang lalong mapaghusay ang pag-aksyon sa mga hazards na maaaring maging disaster. Sa Key Result Area 1, the disaster risk reduction na parte ng thematic pillars, dito nabibilang ang prevention and mitigation at ilang bahagi ng preparedness. Sa prevention and mitigation ay may 8 outcome na sinusupervise ng DOST bilang Vice Chairperson na naka-assign. Bilang Departamento ng Agham at Teknolohiya, sinisiguro ng DOST na nag-i-improve ang gamit sa updated risk information at mga research, maayos na nai-implement sa bawat sektor ang risk-centered policies, plans, and budget, mayroong increase sa structural integrity ng mga housing, building at iba pang infrastructures. Sa DOST rin nakaatas ang timely, responsive, context and culture-specific early warning systems na magagamit sa lahat ng dako ng bansa. Ang bawat komunidad ay may access sa effective response and inclusive social protection, risk financing, and insurance mechanisms. Sinisiguro ng DOST na mayroong disaster-resilient livelihood, business, and human settlements. Ilang specific na hakbang na ginagawa ng DOST ay ang pag-provide ng early warning signals, forecasting and monitoring, hazard and risks mappings, at structural and non-structural interventions. Ang forecasting at monitoring ay side-to-side sa hazard and risk mappings. Bilang example, sa pag-forecast kung saan dadaan ang isang bagyo, mamamonitor ang mga lugar na maaaring tamaan ng bagyo. Gamit ng hazard at risk maps, makikita kung saan ang unang kailangang aksyonan sakali mang lumala ang sitwasyon. Halimbawa naman ng structural and non-structural interventions ang pag-relocate sa mga pamilyang naninirahan malapit sa active fault lines at pagbabawal at ng pagtatayo ng gusali na maaaring maapektuhan sakali mang lumindol. Sa preparedness naman, sa ilalim ng Area 1, inaasahang ma-enhance risk awareness at risk-informed decisions ang mga mamamayan. Mayroon ring pagpapalawak ng kapasidad ng nasyonal at lokal na DRRM councils na tumutugon sa bawat disaster. Isa pang sakop ng preparedness ang pagkakaroon ng matibay na partnership at coordination sa lahat ng mahalagang sektor at stakeholders na maaaring maglaan ng tulong kung sakali mang may sakuna.
Sa ilalim naman ng Key Result Area 2 o tinatawag din na Preparedness and Response, mayroong 5 outcomes. Isa dito ay under pa rin ng preparedness na kung saan ini-implement ang komprehensibong response plans, policies, and systems, pati na rin ang national at lokal na paghahanda. Ang Thematic Area 2 o Preparedness ay pinapangunahan ng DILG o Department of Interior and Local Government bilang Vice Chairperson for Disaster Preparedness ng NDRRMC. Sila ang nangunguna sa planning, prepositioning and stockpiling, organizing responders, at maging sa training, drills, and exercises. Ang main goal ng preparedness ay mapalakas ang kapasidad ng gobyerno at ng komunidad na asahan, makayanan, at makarecover sa impacts ng mga hazards o disasters. Ang apat pa na outcomes sa preparedness and response ay nakasailalim sa Thematic Area 3 o Response and Early Recovery. Ang goal nito ay makapag-provide ng risk-based, timely, and anticipatory response upang ma-address ang basic, life preservation, and immediate needs ng mga komunidad pati na rin ng mga gobyerno. Isa pang goal ay para siguraduhin na maitutuloy ng mga naapektuhan ng disaster ang kanilang mga buhay ng may dignidad at mabawasan rin ang malalang mga emergency situations. Ang mga outcomes na nakapaloob dito ay ang pagtatag ng mga disaster response operations, workforce at mga volunteers. Nagkakaroon din ng early actions para sa mga komunidad at accurate, reliable, and timely na pagdi-disseminate ng mga impormasyon. Ang panghuli ay nakafocus sa mga naapektuhan, binibigyan sila ng kanilang mga pangangailangan at serbisyo. Ang pangatlo at panghuling key result area naman ay tinatawag din na Build Back Better, kung saan focus ito sa pag-recover sa mga disaster. May isang outcome sa response and early recovery na under ng Build Back Better kung saan nag-i-implement ng integrated system for early recovery. Ang response and early recovery ay pinangungunahan naman ng Department of Social Welfare and Development o DSWD bilang Vice Chairperson for Disaster Response. Ilan sa kanilang mga task ay nakafocus sa damage assessment, evacuation, search, rescue and retrieval, relief distribution, at management of evacuation centers. Ang natitirang mga outcomes naman ng Build Back Better ay under ng Rehabilitation and Recovery na nililid naman ng National Economic and Development Authority o NEDA bilang Vice Chairperson for Disaster Rehabilitation and Recovery. Ang Rehabilitation and Recovery ay may 6 na outcomes sa Key Result Area 3. Una, nagbibigay sila ng malinaw na mga polisiya para sa rehabilitasyon at recovery, pati na rin ang sustainable and socially inclusive na mga income sources para ma-restore ang economic activities ng mga nasalanta. Nire-restore din ang agricultural production at nagbibigay ng suporta para sa mga magsasaka, mangingisda at iba pang manggagawa. Ang mga naapektuhan ay binibigyan ng access na magkaroon ng disaster-resilient housing sa mga safe zone o mabigyan ng financing assistance para maipagawang muli ang kanilang mga kabahayan na nasa safe zone. Magkaka-access din sila na magkaroon ng education, health, and social protection services. Panghuli naman sa mga outcomes ay pag-oobserba ng mga disaster resilience standards in infrastructure sa panahon ng rehabilitasyon at recovery. Maiyahayag na nakafocus ang NEDA sa post-disaster needs and assessments, review of policies and plans, resettlement, at new sources of livelihood. Ang mga nabanggit na key result areas at thematic areas ay ang nakasaad sa mga plano ng NDRRM ng Pilipinas na may tema na Resilience Vision, Safer, Adaptive, and Disaster-Resilient Filipino Community for Sustainable Development. Ito ay tungo sa pagkakaroon ng mas maayos na proseso at responses ukol sa paghahanda para sa mga sakuna.
How do we implement the NDRRMP Framework and Plan 2020 to 2030? There are 5 steps to achieve this. First is to develop DRRM action plans that are short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategies. It should contain a proposed timeline and a budget. An annual reporting to the Office of the Civil Defense is required. Aside from this, a thematic pillar plan should also be developed within 1 year upon the approval of the updated NDDRMP. The second step is localizing the NDRRMP. The NDRRMP provides sets of strategies that will facilitate translation of the thematic pillars and outcomes at the local level. It provides recommended guide to localizing the NDRRMP. These guides can be used at the national, regional, and local levels in translating the strategies into actionable items. The third step is reviewing, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. To monitor and assess the progress of the implementation of the NDRRMP outcomes, outputs, and activities have been developed. On the national level, the first step is a submission of the annual progress report. Then, the Office of Civil Defense, in coordination with the DRRM committees, will evaluate against a thematic pillar action plan and come up with a consolidated report for each of the thematic areas. After that, the Office of the Civil Defense will consolidate all the reports from the regional DRRM councils and the national DRRM committees to come up with a consolidated monitoring, evaluation, and progress report on the NDRRMP. Based on the report, the Office of Civil Defense will evaluate the implementation progress on the SFDRR, commitment and targets. Once done, the reports will be presented to the TMG for inputs. Lastly, the reports will be finalized and approved by NDRRMC. On the regional level, DRRM councils will monitor and evaluate the implementation of their RDRRMP. A consolidated report will be submitted after. The local government units should also submit a report to the local DRRM council for evaluation, who will then prepare validation reports for submission to regional DRRM councils. The fourth and last step is financing the plan. The agencies shall determine fund requirements to carry out their action plans. Said priorities shall serve as a basis for the determination of programming for the NDRRMF, subject to the approval of DBM and the House of Representatives.
But of course, our country still faces challenges when it comes to its disaster risk reduction and management. First off, the prevention, preparedness, and response of a community in times of disaster was only based on historical records of disasters in their area. They do not anticipate worst case scenarios or even new types of disasters to occur in their area simply because it has never happened. Because of this, they fail to plan ahead for new types of disasters and end up having losses that may have been avoided. Another challenge in Philippine DRRM is that information about hazards and risks in an area is not always publicly available to the people who live in or are in charge of an area. This makes it harder for a community to properly develop an effective plan of prevention, preparedness, and response to a disaster, and thus puts people of the community at higher risk. Furthermore, there exists communities that face a constant risk of disasters such as earthquakes and yet do not have sufficient funding to have the necessary equipment to properly respond to or prepare its citizens should there be a disaster. This is due to the lack in a budget allocated for the DRRM of these communities. And finally, since the Philippines is not exactly the most technologically advanced country, there is a lack of affordable technology that can be used to conduct multi-risk assessments to better anticipate all possible disasters that may happen in an area. Having this technology would enable a community to have better prevention, preparedness, and response to a disaster that could possibly happen. And now, knowing what we have told you in the previous slides, what can you do to contribute to disaster risk reduction and management in the Philippines? Or at the very least, in your own community? On the barangay level, make sure that your barangay has a team or council that oversees the DRRM of your community, similar to the Barangay Disaster Risk Reduction Management Committee or BDRRMC in Barangay 405 in Manila. Furthermore, you should always keep an eye out for things that may potentially be hazardous or put your community at risk of a disaster. Report these hazards right away to the proper authorities so that they may handle it and make your barangay a safer place from disasters. You should also participate in first aid seminars so that you may contribute to the emergency response of your barangay as a medical aid. You should also participate in earthquake drills and fire drills done by your community to ensure you know the proper procedure in case these disasters occur. By simply knowing these, you can make the disaster plan of your community be more successful if the time comes for you to apply your knowledge. Now for DRRM on the family level. Make sure you and your family members know the basic procedures when it comes to disasters. These include practices like the drop, cover, and hold procedure when there is an earthquake. This is when you go lower, take cover under a sturdy piece of furniture such as a table to protect yourself, and hold on until the shakes stop and it is safe to evacuate. Also make sure that you and your family members take note of and know the important emergency hotline numbers to call to ask for help or assistance in times of an emergency. And finally, make sure that you and your family are always prepared if a disaster should occur. Always keep a go bag close by that contains only the essentials such as food, drinks, identification cards, light sources, etc. that will help you if you need to evacuate and stay away from home for a while. Keep an eye out for warning signals of an approaching disaster so that a speedy response can be made and minimize the risk of loss. Educate you and your family about the nearest evacuation centers to go to in the case that you are separated during the disaster. Know the possible disasters that can occur in your area and the proper responses to them. Always have backup plans in case your initial plan is not a viable option. And make sure to stay updated within your community so that you are able to get information and news right away instead of waiting for it to reach you. So why do we need to study proper DRRM? Us students will soon be the ones who will be in charge of our country, and it is our job to learn how to protect ourselves from disasters that endanger our country. We should be able to do our best to make sure disasters such as the Haiti earthquake of 2010 that caused the death of thousands, and the Chile earthquake of 2010 that costed billions of dollars of damage do not happen here. As a final point, remember these two things. First, no history is not equal to exemption, meaning that even if the disaster has never occurred in an area, does not mean that it never will. The land, climate, and many other factors change over time. This can bring about new possible hazards that we should watch out for. And second, disasters are not natural. It is only when people are affected by a hazard does it become a disaster. This means an earthquake is only the hazard. If your community is properly equipped to withstand the earthquake with little to no loss or damage, then it is not a disaster. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful day.